They had known each other for years, not in the way people usually mean when they say that, not just through proximity or repetition, but in that deeper, quieter way that comes from watching someone live beside you without ever fully stepping into your life. Layla and Daniel had shared cities, offices, mutual friends, moments that skimmed the surface of what could have been more, all while carefully, deliberately, never crossing the invisible line they both pretended not to see. It had started innocently enough. They met at a conference, two assistants balancing trays of lukewarm coffee and schedules printed in the wrong font, and somehow ended up sitting on the same bench outside, sharing silence between panels neither of them cared about. He had said something dry. She had laughed in a way she rarely did, not loudly, but with that quiet softness that meant it wasn't for show. From there, the rhythm formed, not daily contact, not even frequent, but consistent in its own way. Messages. Random calls. A birthday text. A book recommendation. Years passed like that. Never more. Never less. They were both in relationships at various points. Sometimes overlapping, sometimes not. They never spoke about it. They never flirted. There was no boundary to draw because nothing ever happened. But between them, there was always something. A certain pause when their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same glass. A look held a little too long in crowded rooms. A hesitation at the end of every conversation, as if they both expected, or feared, that one day someone would say what they both refused to say. Layla used to tell herself it was just familiarity. That if she missed him when they didn't speak for a few weeks, it was habit. That if her heart moved a little when she saw his name light up her screen, it was simply comfort. But the truth sat quietly beneath those lies. She had built a version of her life where he was always there in the margins, never central, never absent. Like an unfinished sentence she couldn't bear to end. And Daniel, he never pushed. Never said too much. But his consistency was its own confession. He remembered everything. How she took her coffee. The only song she refused to listen to. The way her voice changed when she was pretending not to be tired. He remembered the details no one else did, and carried them like pieces of a story he wasn't allowed to write. Then came that night. Neither of them had planned it. It wasn't a celebration or a reunion or anything dramatic. Just a small dinner with a few colleagues. People came, laughed, left early. The city was humid with late summer heat, and by the end of the night, they were the only two left, standing outside the restaurant, unsure whether to say goodbye, or finally say something else. Layla had worn a dark green dress. She didn't choose it for him. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. They walked without deciding to, through quiet streets lit by storefronts already closed, the silence between them deeper than it had ever been, not heavy, but expectant. And somewhere along that walk, the line they had drawn all those years ago began to blur, not because of any sudden declaration, but because they had run out of ways to pretend it wasn't there. She stopped under a street lamp, arms crossed loosely, and looked at him. Not with a smile. Not with a question. Just a kind of stillness. And he looked back, the same way he always had, with too much softness for someone who wasn't supposed to care. Neither of them spoke. But everything between them shifted. It could have ended there, with a glance, a pause, the familiar retreat they'd rehearsed for years, and maybe it would have, if either of them had spoken first, had broken the spell with a joke or a gentle goodbye or a comment about the weather. But no words came. Only stillness. Only the sound of their breathing, synchronized like they'd somehow spent years preparing for this silence together. Daniel took one small step forward. Not enough to close the distance between them, but enough to break the safety of it. And when Layla didn't move away, didn't fold into herself or look away or reach for her phone as she always did when things felt too close, he let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. There was a vulnerability in her posture that night that he'd never seen before, not weakness, not surrender, but openness. The kind that comes only when you're too tired to pretend anymore, too full of what you've been carrying to keep holding it in. And maybe she wasn't even aware of it. Maybe she didn't know that every guarded conversation, every carefully managed tone, every casual message they'd exchanged had led here, to this unremarkable sidewalk, under a flickering street lamp, at the end of a night they hadn't expected to matter. But it did. It mattered in ways neither of them would fully understand until later, much later. She spoke first. Barely. This isn't nothing. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement. It was an admission, cracked open and left hanging between them like a bridge half built. He didn't rush to cross it. He never had. But this time, he did something he had never done before. He reached for her hand. Not quickly. Not boldly. Just, deliberately. And when she let him, he held it the way you hold something you've been waiting years to touch, gently, with both fear and reverence. They stood like that for minutes that didn't feel like minutes. And no one said anything more. There was nothing to add. Nothing to explain. Nothing to name. After that night, nothing changed, and yet, everything did. They didn't jump into a relationship. They didn't start introducing each other as anything new. They didn't rush. Because what existed between them had never been about speed. It had been about timing. About truth. About all the moments they had chosen not to act, and now, finally, about the one moment when they did. They began to meet more often, but not every day. They spoke more openly, but not all at once. They started, not from the beginning, but from exactly where they had paused themselves years ago. She told him things in pieces. Like how she used to check his name in old group messages just to make sure he hadn't left. Or how she remembered the one time he called her at 2 a.m. by mistake, and how she'd stayed up after, just in case he called again. And he told her that her silence had never felt like absence to him, it had felt like patience. That he'd never been unsure of what she meant to him, only unsure if she'd ever allow herself to believe it. One evening, months later, as they sat on her living room floor surrounded by takeout boxes and half-watched movies, she looked over at him and said, "I spent years convincing myself I imagined this." He didn't laugh. He didn't say me too. He just looked at her like he always did, with that calm, unwavering gaze that had never tried to demand anything from her. And replied simply, "Then let's never go back to pretending again." And she didn't. Because sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't arrive with certainty, or fanfare, or declarations under fireworks. Sometimes it lives quietly beside you for years, folded into late-night texts and almost touching hands and questions left unanswered. Until one night, you finally let it answer itself. Love, the kind that lasts, isn't always something you fall into. Sometimes, it's something you carry for years. And only realize you've been holding it when someone else finally reaches for it too.